I think we are now live. I'll just wait for a sound check, to be honest, first. I know there's a couple of seconds delay. So please let me know if you can hear me, and then just put a message in the comment box, and then we will start, inshallah. Excellent. Thank you, Mesa, as always. So let's start. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Revision session 1. And I'm doing the first session, alhamdulillah. We are going to be starting with chapter 22. We actually started this chapter in year 10. We've completed year 11, and now we're going to be going into year 12. So this is a bit of year 10 going into year 11. So without any further ado, let's get started. Hopefully you can see everything clearly. The text that we will be going through will always be in blue. I'm sure after 10 years, 11 years, you're used to this by now. And then the explanation, usually Sheikh Uthaymeen's explanation, any evidence that we bring is usually in black. And then the class positions are usually in red. And at the end of these slides, probably the most important part are the tabulated summaries. The tabulated summaries contain the Hanbali class position, what we agree upon. So for now, the blue text is important, but yes, the red text is where we differ, and there's a separate class position. Like I said, I'll be summarizing and indicating about the revision resources other than the slides at the end. I, over the last few years, have added a few more colors and underlined things. That's not because it's important as such, it's just for me to remember to pick up on certain points. So hopefully that doesn't confuse you. So we are on Babu Salat al-Jama'ah, the congregational prayer. And this is the text, inshallah. It is required for men to pray in congregation for the 5 daily prayers, but it is not a condition. It can be prayed in his house. It is recommended for the border guards to pray in a single mosque. For others, it is better to pray in a mosque that would not establish a congregation without him, then the mosque that has the larger congregation, then the mosque which is oldest. The further away the mosque is, the better. It is prohibited to lead in a mosque without the permission of the official imam, or unless he is excused. Whoever prays and then the obligatory prayer is established, it is a sunnah to repeat his prayer with them except for Maghrib. It is not disliked to repeat a congregational prayer other than in the 2 mosques of Mecca and Medina. If the prayer is established, there is no other prayer to be offered other than the obligatory prayer. So that is the text. I've just realized that the slides that I'm going through are over here and the camera is over here. So that's not good. So I'm actually going to do something that Shazad might not be happy about. I'm going to move the camera position in middle of the class. So just bear with me. I can feel Shaz's displeasure already. Hopefully, I'm just going to wait to make sure that the camera angle is right before I carry on. That'll do. So that is the text in blue, and now we're going to carry on. So we are in Al-Sharh al-Mumti', volume 4. Don't ask me how many volumes there are, but after 10 years we're on volume 4. We're on page 132, chapter the prayer in congregation. So that's our starting point for today. Obviously the transcribed notes and the recordings go through in much more detail. This is a summary of those classes, hopefully helping you towards the exam. So these, the congregational prayer, are targeting specific prayers which are performed in congregation. This is legislated by the consensus of the Ummah of Islam. It is one of the greatest acts of worship, from the most magnificent acts of obedience. So we know that the obligatory prayers, the 5 obligatory prayers, Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib and Isha, they're obligatory. However, what we're saying here, and this is something that we need to establish very early on, that the congregational prayer is also legislated. And this is what we're going to go through over the next few slides. So Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen says there's no difference in this matter within the Ummah. Everybody agrees that the Jama'ah, the congregational prayer, is a legislated act of worship in of itself. Sheikh Uthaymeen goes on a slight side point and mentions a sect of the Shia, extreme sect called the Rafida, who he mentions that they don't pray in Jama'ah unless it's one of the 12 Imams, and they don't know the concept of Jum'ah. We kind of went through that and said actually that's not correct. They are aware of these concepts. So really, there is a consensus on this. So the main debate regarding the congregational prayer has been whether it is an absolute individual obligation, fard al-ain, as opposed to fard al-kifaya, i.e. some people attending the congregational prayer is enough to cover everybody else. Everybody still has to pray the prayer individually, but a congregational concept of it is covered by some people praying it. And this is what we're going to be looking at. Or is it a highly emphasized sunnah? So it has to be established. It's highly emphasized sunnah, but it's still a fard al-kifaya. We're going to come to this later on, because whichever ruling we go with is going to have implications. So starting at the beginning of the text, it is required for men to pray in congregation. Sheikh says, what does this mean, required or lazim? What's the legal consequence of this specific word? Sheikh Uthaymeen now brings evidences to back up his opinion that it is an absolute individual obligation. There are many scholars, and Hanbali obviously school backing this, and obviously the most famous of these Hanbalis is Ibn Taymiyyah. But by the way, all four schools have somewhere along the way, whether it's a minor opinion, mentioning the obligatory nature. However, in the Hanbali school, it's actually a position. There's no difference as a bare minimum that it's a sunnah, a highly emphasized sunnah across all four schools. We have to say though, the majority of scholars consider the Jama'ah prayer or the prayer in the masjid not to be an obligation, but rather a highly emphasized sunnah. So I hope that makes sense. In terms of questions, I will try to pick up on these on the way. Let me just quickly see if there's anything there. Okay. That's fine. So let's go back to the slides. So yes, we've covered this. So it's lazim, and we're going to go through the evidences for what evidences Sheikh Uthaymeen, the Hanbali school, come up with to indicate that this is an obligation. So we start with, as of course, the Quran. The Sheikh begins with this ayah from Surah An-Nisa. When you, Prophet, are with the believers, leading them in prayer, let a group of them stand up in prayer with you. What's the context of this? This is the prayer being established during a wartime situation. So فَلْتَكُمْ, this lam is a lam of command. The basic ruling in a command is that it's obligatory. And we have to take into context or in consideration what we're talking about here. This is the prayer in a war, pressure, fear situation, where not just the prayer is being obligated, which we would assume, but the congregational prayer. And so this is what makes this ayah unique, and backing up the Hanbali opinion that is a obligatory nature of the congregational prayer. So the Salat al-Khawf, and when they have finished, to continue, when they have finished their prostration, let them take their positions at the back. So this prayer that we're talking about in a situation of war is normally cut down to two. So for example, in the situation of Dhuhr and Asr, by the way, I'm not going to go into too much of the Salat al-Khawf, because we're actually going to cover this later on in as we go through the books. But I'll give a quick summary here. So this situation, what this ayah is referring to, is the prayer where the prayer for Dhuhr and Asr, for example, is cut down to 2 and 2. And the 2 rak'ah of Dhuhr, for example, how would it be prayed? The first group of people, there'd be two groups. First group would start with the Imam. The Imam would do the first rak'ah, and so would the group following. Then the Imam would pause before going to the second rak'ah, and the group would complete their prayer and then allow the second group to come, who would then join the prayer. They complete their first rak'ah and then complete the second rak'ah with the imam and giving taslim. So this is a kind of short summary of the Salat al-Khawf. There's different versions of this. And yes, someone mentioned in the Telegram group there was a bit of confusion, and actually I was confused. I didn't know which way was which. This is, and you guys can back me up on this, this specific type of prayer is in a situation where the enemy is behind you and you need someone guarding you from behind. Whereas if the enemy is in front of you, then there is no two groups praying at separate times. They'd be praying together, but that's a slightly different scenario. So hopefully that makes sense. And when they have finished their prostration, let them take their positions at the back. Then let the other group who have not yet prayed pray with you also, on their guard and armed with their weapons. So the key point here is not how the Salat al-Khawf is prayed, how this is prayed in that extreme situation. Rather, it's about, this is a command to split into two groups and pray in congregation, no matter what almost. We made a side point within the class that this is referring to classical warfare. What happens in modern warfare? This would be difficult to implement. And actually, we saw in the time of the Prophet ﷺ that he was not able to pray actually 4 prayers, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib and Isha. He had to pray all together at the end of the day because it was non-stop combat. So extreme situations require thinking about. But this is, again, just emphasizing the important nature of a congregational prayer. Now we need to quickly touch on what Fard al-Ain and Fard al-Kifaya means. Over the years we've mentioned this plenty of times, but just to remind ourselves, Fard al-Ain is individual obligation. For example, something like the daily prayers, Fajr prayer, you have to pray it for yourself. Nobody can pray that for you. That's an individual obligation. You can only lift that obligation by you praying it. Whereas the Fard al-Kifaya, for example, a Janazah prayer, as long as someone within the community, a number of people within the community pray it, then it lifts the obligation for everybody else. And if nobody prays it, then everybody is sinful in that community, essentially. And this is important, this definition is important to remember, because why are we saying that the congregational prayer is a Fard al-Ain? Because the prayer itself is Fard al-Ain, and now we're praying in congregation Fard al-Ain. I'm hoping that you can see this difference and the importance of looking at this in that way. Shaykh Uthaymeen says if it was a Fard al-Kifaya, then the first group would have prayed on behalf of the second group, who could carry on guarding, and then they could pray individually. Can you see where he's coming from? But he said no. If you look at the ayah, then let the other group who have not yet prayed then pray. So he says based on this, it's clearly not a Fard al-Kifaya, and that would be sufficient for him. But obviously now we've mentioned the Quranic evidences. We're now going to go to the Sunnah, where there are many evidences. So the hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, that the Prophet ﷺ said, very important hadith, to be honest, we're going to be coming back to this hadith many times. I thought to give orders for arranging prayer in congregation, and then to have the iqamah called for it, then to order a man to lead the people in prayer, then go off in the company of the people who have bundles of firewood to those people who are not present at the prayer, and then to burn down their houses with fire. I'll be honest, this hadith still sends shiver down my spine, to be honest. A reminder to us all the importance of the congregational prayer, and in this case Fajr specifically. So Shaykh Uthaymeen discusses the statement of burning the houses and the legal consequences. And weirdly enough, actually the scholars who say that this is actually a highly emphasized sunnah rather than obligatory use this hadith. How? They use it by saying that if the Prophet ﷺ, if it was obligatory, he would have burned the houses. I hope you can see the point, and therefore because he didn't, therefore it means it's a highly emphasized sunnah. Shaykh Uthaymeen responds and says, actually no, because nobody except for the Lord of fire can use fire to punish. That's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not a human being, not the Prophet ﷺ. So no one is allowed to punish by fire. There is an addition to this hadith, Imam Ahmad's version of this hadith. In the Musnad, he says, I wish that I would go and burn down the houses of the people who do not attend the prayer, burn those houses down. I would have done that, except that it has women and children in there. But this increase is actually weak. So that's a hadith that Shaykh Uthaymeen is using to say, look at how severe the Prophet's feelings are for those who don't attend the congregational prayer. Another hadith of a blind man who came to the Prophet, this blind man who found it very difficult to get to the masjid, obviously because of his sight, age, etc. He asked the Prophet for permission not to attend the masjid for the congregational prayer. The Prophet replied, can you hear the adhan? And he said, yes. And he sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, then respond to the adhan, i.e. if you can hear the adhan, you're going to have to go. And then the hadith which is narrated in the Sunan, that the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever hears the call to the adhan and does not come, his prayer is not valid, except for those who have an excuse. Right, quite clear. However, it's not the most authentic of hadith. And this is one of, I think, the hadith that Ibn Taymiyyah, strongly uses to support his position. So we've talked about the evidences in the Sunnah, Quranic evidences. Now we have some what we call athar or comments from the companions. So in Sahih Muslim, Abdullah ibn Masud radiallahu anhu said, I have seen the time when no one stayed away from it except a hypocrite. We're talking about the congregational prayer, who was well known for his hypocrisy. So actually the companions almost saw someone who didn't attend the congregational prayer, it was a sign of being a munafiq, a hypocrite. It's quite severe really. So Shaykh Uthaymeen explains further, almost indicating the obligatory nature of the congregational prayer. Now Shaykh Uthaymeen goes into some of the benefits and wisdoms. There's a long explanation of this. In the top right hand corner you can see it says 22.3. This is to indicate we're in chapter 22, and in the transcribed notes number 3. So you can see a lot of this in much more detail in those transcribed notes. We're just summarizing here. So Shaykh Uthaymeen lists a few benefits and wisdoms. It increases the love between people. Number 2, you start to understand the situations of your people as well. Number 3, it's promoting the rights of Muslims. It's showing the people, the Muslims, the ritualistic side of the Muslim. So people are aware of it, it gets promoted, and then it's easier to do. Shaykh Uthaymeen also mentioned number 4 that it shows the power of the Muslims, a group of people being able to come together like that. It also has the benefit of educating those who don't know. Who are we talking about here in point 5? There are people within our community who don't understand their prayer, how to pray, what to say. They're considered Muslims, how to correct a mistake, and they can learn by being in a group of other Muslims. I don't know what's happened there, there's a typo there. You are elevating and promoting the points of Islam, and that is Salah. And then number 6, getting the Ummah used into the habit of coming together, which is important, very important. It's a representation of the Ummah. And when you have these people, group of Muslims coming to worship Allah, you also have the angels coming together, so it's a source of barakah. Number 7, the development of discipline, when it comes to training people to follow the Imam, to be with each other, to put their differences aside, to have good timekeeping. I'll say it again, to have good timekeeping. Number 8, developing in the hearts and minds in the Muslim of having discipline. And this is important when it comes to jihad, the organization that's required, being connected to the people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, to emphasize this point in Surah Saf, God truly loves those who fight in solid lines for his cause like a well compacted wall. So this wall that we see in the salah, no gaps between each other, solid, a solid foundation of a building. Number 9, attending the masjid reminds one of the angels, and not only are you praying, the lines of angels that when they're worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so having that empathy with them, and their love for the angels as well. Number 10, to increase empathy for and equality for the people around you. So when you come to the masjid, everybody's equal, everybody's had to do wudu, everybody's had to travel to the masjid. You now have to follow the person, an appointed person that may not be as rich as you, may not be as knowledgeable as you, but he's the appointed Imam and we are following him. So this is for this reason, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and commanding the straight lines, not having dissension between the hearts, as the Prophet ﷺ said, do not be irregular for there would be dissension in your hearts. This is promoting that equality, something that we see in Hajj. Number 11, a person gets to see about the state of people around them, whether they're ill, the poor, the needy, and the heart will be softened and therefore increase in giving sadaqah rather than living in your own little bubbles. Number 12, the actual reason and wisdom behind the congregation is the congregation itself. We've mentioned this word, the illah. The gathering itself, when it comes to the congregational prayer, is the illah, and it's the reason for the worship. And a person feels like the people of the past, when congregations were large and well attended, all the way back to the companions. They were the ones we mentioned. They considered a person who didn't turn up to be a munafiq, or it'd be a sign of their munafiq. So by following their footsteps in the congregational prayer, we are closer to them. So we looked at the Quranic evidences, the Sunnah evidences, the statements of the companions, the benefits, which we actually, although the Shaykh Uthaymeen's stated them, we all feel them when we go to a congregational prayer. So Shaykh Uthaymeen says all of this put together indicates that the congregational prayer is a fard al-ain, an individual obligation. We mentioned that some try to downgrade it to a fard al-kifaya, meaning as long as some people attending the congregational prayer, that was enough, and some people said it's just a highly emphasized sunnah. And the main the evidence that they use for this is that the prayer in congregation is 27 times superior to the prayer offered by a person alone. So what do you think about this, guys? Because this would make you think, if it's 27 times superior, that means although the individual prayer is inferior, it's still a valid prayer. Must be, right? And Shaykh Uthaymeen's not happy with this. He says this type of using this type of evidence, this istidlal, is a very weak way of interpreting and using the evidences. And he gives examples, because I think you have to in this scenario. He gives examples of a number of ayah in the Quran where the mentioning of the excellence does not negate its obligation. I put that in orange there, and we're going to go through this ayah. So, you who believe, shall I show you a bargain that will save you from a painful torment? Have faith in God and His Messenger and struggle for His cause with your possessions and your persons. That is better for you, if only you knew. So I've underlined that what we need to focus in on here. Does this phrase, this is better for you, what we're talking about? Believing in Allah and His Messenger. Surely that's an obligation, right? That's an obligation. But here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking the question, surely it's better for you if you have faith. And Shaykh Uthaymeen is using this as an analogy for the congregational prayer being 27 times better. So, although here, when you look at if you look at it for word, you would think better than you just means it's sunnah, but rather this is an obligation, and this is an example. Another example is regarding Jum'ah. So Surah Al-Jum'ah, believers, when the call to prayer is made on the day of congregation, Jum'ah, hurry towards a reminder of God and leave off your trading. That is better for you, if only you knew. Again, it is better for you. Does this mean it's a sunnah or it's an obligation? We all know it's an obligation. So here it's emphasizing that you really should be attending Jum'ah because it is better for you and it's an obligation. So Shaykh Uthaymeen concludes that the class position is that the congregational prayer is a fard al-ain, and not fard al-kifaya. Okay, so I think that point's made. So the next point, now that we've established that, is it is required. So we've done that part. That's all we've done so far. It is required. It's lazim. It's fard al-ain for men. So just to go back to what is a jama'ah, by default usually it means masjid. However, a clarification is made by the Hanbali madhab that the congregation can also happen outside of the masjid. It can happen in one's house. So we're talking about specifically men here. So who's not included in this? And the group that are not included, we're going to talk about first, are the women. So they are not required to pray in congregation. And that is because they are not the people of the congregation. They are not required to represent Islam in the way that men are. So Abu Isa goes into big detail about the cultural and societal norms, how they change the function, roles and responsibilities of men and women. I'm not going to get involved in that. The chapter 22:4 is where you can go into the big discussion in that. But specifically when we're talking about the congregational prayer, it's not an obligatory obligation on women. And actually we're going to see in the madhabs, in the madahib, there are significant differences. And starting with the Prophet ﷺ saying regarding women, their homes are better for them. So this is termed as a Sahih hadith, but Shaykh Abu Isa mentions that many of the hadith related to this are generally weak, and makes a point of saying that there's actually no extra reward just for them praying at home. However, if they make that intention that they're not going to the masjid because they're praying at home, and based on this hadith, then there's that extra reward. However, the other madahib, majority of scholars say that actually this is authentic and women are rewarded regardless of the intention. However, so that's one thing about attending the masjid. What about a congregation? Congregational prayer, because remember it can happen inside a masjid and outside a masjid. And we're talking about specifically women here. The Malikiya have said not possible, because they said the congregation, one of the sharts of a congregation is the maleness of basically you have to be a man. So that's an opinion there. The Hanafis consider it makruh, and one of the evidences they use is Aisha radiallahu anha's statement of women attending the masjid, where she said, if he sallallahu alaihi wasallam was here today, he would prohibit this situation, meaning the amount of women that were coming to pray in congregation. But wait a second, the Prophet ﷺ clearly said, do not prevent the female servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from going to the houses of Allah. So where's this opinion of Aisha come from? And we mentioned this in the class that we think it's probably in the context of the norm of the time, because we have many indications in the Quran and Sunnah of the protocols on men and women attending, leaving, the space within the masjid. There's too many things there for it not to be a reality. So it's clearly something that is part of our religion. So let's go through the positions. Let's summarize this a bit. As for the first position, that is, it's sunnah for her to pray at home. The Prophet ﷺ ordered Waraka to lead the people of the household. So he ordered Waraka to pray in congregation with the people of the household. And so this, at the bare minimum, indicates that it's allowed. And this is going to be our class position. If there's a jama'ah established at home, that's good, if it's possible to do. If there's an opportunity there, take it. It's good. The other positions, which we're still going to go through, even though we've established our class position, is that it's disliked. So that's the other hadith. The hadith that mentioned that it's indicating that it's weak, we said it was weak. We know it wasn't the norm of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ, but it happened clearly because we have too many narrations to say that it's disliked. This group also argued that the Jama'ah is all about coming together and promoting the deen. And we said at the beginning that women aren't required to do that. But we're talking about people establishing the Jama'ah within the household. So this point isn't valid either. So the third position, so we've gone through Sunnah, Makruh. Third position, that is allowed. They are part of the Jama'ah, of course they are. And that's why it's allowed for them to go to the mosque. We have established that. To establish the Jama'ah, we've established that. Otherwise they wouldn't be allowed to go to the mosque. And we clearly said, the Prophet ﷺ said, don't prohibit them from going. So it's something that's clearly allowed. So Shaykh Uthaymeen concludes his position is that it's allowed. So that's the third position. Our class position is where the opportunity is there to establish a Jama'ah. That's great, go for it, without it ever being obligatory upon them. There are other groups that we need to quickly mention. So children, not obligated either. You have to be mature, bulugh, The third category we also mentioned very quickly, hermaphrodites, unless they know they are leaning one way or another in terms of their sexual characteristics. So that's again another topic. The last one that Sheikh Uthaymeen mentions is the slave. So the male slave has to attend the Jama'ah. Obviously not a specific reality in today's day and age, but this is important because it again shows the importance of the Jama'ah. So the male slave has an owner, the master. The master has to seek permission to be able to go. If the master says no, then that's a pretty strict issue within the Sharia. It's considered a major sin, disobedience of the slave to his master. However, in this situation, some of the scholars say that he doesn't have to obey the master. Big call. Sheikh Uthaymeen says actually that's a bit harsh. The slave is obligated, however, still has to seek permission from his master. Again, showing the importance of the congregational prayer. But it is not a condition. What do we mean by this? So we've established that it's an obligation. What we haven't established, or what we need to now disprove, is it a condition, i.e. a shart means that if you don't do the specific issue that is a shart, the act is invalid. And there are some people that consider the congregational prayer to be a condition. By the way, yes, Sheikh Uthaymeen mentions if we consider it an obligation, that would mean it's for the traveller and non-traveller. And we're going to come to some of the evidences for this. So some specific evidences that it's obligation, and could it go to the level of a shart? Let's talk about the travellers first, and we have some specific evidences. One of the most famous ones is the Prophet ﷺ, when he used to travel, used to pray in Jama'ah all the time. And there was one situation where the Sahaba, while travelling, they all overslept, including the Prophet ﷺ. And he asked Bilal on waking up, why did you not wake us up? And he said, for the same reason as you. And so they made adhan, they prayed the sunnah, and they prayed in Jama'ah. This is after Fajr prayer has passed. So they prayed a qada prayer. Now I'm going to come back to that because that's what it says in transcribed notes. You guys tell me whether this is a qada prayer or is it ada. So we'll come back to that. So the majority opinion is that it's a sunnah. Significant minority consider it obligatory, which we've already mentioned. We've already established this, mainly the Hanbali school. The very small extreme opinion consider it to be a shart, a condition, and that's some Hanbalis, including Ibn Taymiyyah. We've deflected away from the fard al-kifaya. That's not an issue. And the reason why it's not a shart, because that hadith that we mentioned, if anyone hears him who makes the call to prayer and is not prevented from joining the congregation by any excuse, the prayer he offers will not be accepted from him. We mentioned that this is weak. And even if we look at the wording, la salah, it doesn't mean there is no salah. We mentioned this many times in the past, the different times of lam or la. This one is indicating it's not a complete prayer. It's not a perfect prayer. It's a prayer with deficiency. So I think it's clear that it's not a shart. It's not a condition. We have settled upon it's an obligatory nature, whereas the vast majority of scholars consider it a highly emphasized sunnah. Okay, so which prayers are we talking about? It's obvious, but we have to go through this as it's in the text. It is required for men to pray in congregation for the 5 daily prayers. However, there are other obligatory prayers which are not done in congregation. So one of the prayers that we mentioned is the al-mandura, which is a prayer you vow to pray. So if I pass my exams, I will pray X. That X becomes obligatory because you made a vow, and not to do it is sinful. So that's an obligatory prayer, essentially, yes, but it's not a congregational prayer. The Jum'ah prayer, which takes the place of the Dhuhr prayer, is slightly different, so it doesn't really count, but again, it's a congregational prayer. The eclipse prayer, so Salatul Khusuf, the majority of scholars consider it to be a sunnah, rather than an obligation. So we didn't really count that. There are some non-obligatory prayers which are prayed in congregation. So some people pray the Qiyam al-Layl, the most famous of that version being Taraweeh prayer, and we mentioned a few others there, Salat al-Istisqa. We mentioned about Qiyam al-Layl though, that's the asl, that's actually a individual prayer rather than a congregational prayer. Sheikh finishes this little section off mentioning that these 5 daily prayers, which are obligatory to pray in congregation, even if you've missed the time, then that doesn't take away from trying to establish a congregation. And we mentioned the example for this where the Prophet ﷺ and the companions missed Fajr prayer and then prayed together the Fajr prayer. And the answer to the question, the Prophet ﷺ said, he who forgets the prayer should pray it when he remembers it. There is no expiation for it except this, i.e. praying. So this is ada. A person hasn't sinned if it was done accidentally or there were reasonable reasons for it. The next part is it can be prayed in his house. So this is the next big part. Should be prayed in the masjid, congregational prayer, obligatory individually, but it can be prayed in his house, even if the masjid is close. It is allowed to pray in the home by establishing a jama'ah. The scholars who established this opinion say that the evidence for this is the earth, i.e. the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, the earth has been made for me a masjid and a purifier. So masjidan wa tahuran. This is something specific to this ummah, a great blessing that the land has been made for us to pray on, and the earth is something that can purify us. However, this is talking about the ability to pray and the ability to use the earth to purify yourself, tayammum. It's not talking about establishing the congregational prayer here, there and everywhere. So Shaykh Uthaymeen wasn't really buying that. And it's worth remembering that if that was the case, why would the Prophet ﷺ be so upset and mention such severe ramifications of people not attending the masjid when we talked about collecting the firewood and burning the houses? The issue wasn't that they had prayed or not prayed, the issue was that they hadn't come to the masjid to pray in congregation. Just to mention this issue about the travellers, we came to the conclusion that it's not obligated on the traveller, but it's obligated on the resident. And the class position is that the jama'ah is an obligation, but not a condition. So we agree with that. And we have to remember this. The definition of obligation is you are rewarded for doing it. If you don't do it, you're sinful. So this is the implications that I was talking about. So if you don't have a valid excuse for not attending the jama'ah, you're potentially sinning, although you're lifting the obligation of the individual obligatory prayer. Hope that makes sense. Moving on to the next major section now is the borders. It is recommended for border guards to pray in a single mosque. This is referring to people who are guarding the boundaries, the kind of limits, protecting from enemies coming. What is their primary objective? Their primary objective is to protect the borders, and they may lose sight of that by praying in congregation. So their primary aim is to pray individually rather than in a congregation. So we went through quite a bit of discussion about this, because yes, obviously congregation would be important normally. So we are going to go against the grain here, against the text here, and say actually praying individually is better. Sheikh Muhammad al-Mukhtar al-Shankiti mentions actually praying in congregation may be good for morale, etc, etc. But that's the class position there. Moving on, for others it is better to pray in a mosque that would not establish the congregation without him. So for example, if you are the imam who knows the Quran, is an important part of establishing a congregation in a certain mosque, and by you not going, that congregation wouldn't be established, and it's for you need to go to that mosque rather than the others. For everybody else, it's better to pray in bigger mosques, busier mosques. This is a more blessed objective based on the hadith, A man's prayer said along with another is purer than his prayer said alone. And his prayer with two men is purer than his prayer with one. But if there are more, it is more pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So clearly showing the more people there are, the better. So this is an authentic hadith. However, we did mention in the class, in cases of necessity, going to a different mosque, smaller mosque, etc., etc. These things are flexible. We did mention a small mosque. If it's near a big mosque and it's struggling, shouldn't have a small mosque near a big mosque. There should be one really. Then the mosque that has a larger congregation. So we're going to go through now the different categories of things that are important when it comes to a mosque. But these are all based on the masjids being equal distance. So you have several mosques and you have to make a choice of which one to go to. You're going to go to the one that has a larger congregation. Okay, next. Same congregations, what's next? The mosque which is the oldest. And the reason for this is... they said the reason for this was because people started obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in these places, houses of Allah, for longer. They started there first. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Tawbah, you should rather pray in a mosque founded from its first day on consciousness of God. So clear text there. But is this indicating a mosque? And is it indicating one mosque in particular? Some scholars argued yes. And they refer to Masjid Quba, which is the first mosque that was ever built by a person. Many of the companions, when asked about this, actually said no, Masjid al-Nabawi. This is not referring to, we mentioned in the class, the Kaaba and Al-Aqsa, as these were built by angels, and Prophet Ibrahim rebuilt or redid the foundations. However, essentially we're talking about the masjids, although there are opinions about Masjid Quba. So, if there are two mosques that are the same in congregation, same in size, but one is close and one is further, the Hanbali madhab say the further one is better. Why? Because every footstep that you take, you get rewarded and you take away a sin. There's a hadith to back this up. Shaykh Uthaymeen says actually, yes, we accept the hadith, and we'll come back to that in a second, but the whole point of the mosque is to build the community. Neighbours come together to pray together, building that unity. That's what brings the structure and the imam and the community together. Sheikh Muhammad Mukhtar, he mentions the hadith that we wanted to back up his opinion. Every step he takes towards the mosque, he is upgraded 1 degree in reward, and 1 sin is taken off or crossed out from his account of deeds. Shaykh Uthaymeen's opinion on this hadith is rather it's for people to encourage them to go to a mosque if it's far away. And we know that this motivation is required when there's difficulty, so it's far away, or there's bad conditions, there's illness, etc., etc. So this is more to indicate or encourage the Muslim to attend the congregation even though it's far away. And we know the basic principle. The Prophet ﷺ said to Aisha radiallahu anha, indeed your reward is equal to your hardship. Shaykh Uthaymeen adds, if the masjid which is further away is better in recitation, for example, and you feel closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it increases one person in khushu'ah, it's better to go there. And you would agree with that. And we mentioned a qaida, a principle. It's a bit long one to be honest, but essentially the excellence of the issue or the priority of what is better in these scenarios is always going to be that which is better in the act of worship intrinsically, as opposed to the place of where the worship is offered. I think that's very long-winded. It probably doesn't make sense. Essentially what it's saying is that the act of worship, whatever improves that, is better than where you actually worship. Does that make sense? So yes, whether the masjid is closer or bigger, wherever you essentially are able to pray a better prayer and have that khushu'ah is good, taking into account those parameters that we talked about. Next section is the regular imam. So it is not permissible to lead a congregation in a masjid that has a regular imam except by his permission or if there is a reason. So it's not permissible for someone to lead the prayer, whether it is an Imam Ratib, the Imam of the area, an appointed person. It's very important because the integrity of the mosque is important, and the part of the integrity of the mosque is the integrity of the Imam. The Imam is someone who has been established, chosen, put in a position by the trustees, the locals. Someone to come in and pray in his place is a big no-no. And the Prophet emphasizes this. No man must lead another in prayer where the latter has the authority. And this includes going to people's houses. So the person, head of the household, is the person who would lead the prayer unless he gave permission for someone else to pray. This is despite the Prophet saying the one who is most versed in Allah's book should act as Imam for the people. So we have the criteria for leading the prayer. Yep. However, we have a loophole or a caveat. So normally it's the person who's the most versed, and we mentioned not necessarily the person who has memorized the most, who's aware of the rules, who has the correct tajweed, who understands the Quran, the rulings, etc., etc. And that should be the person who normally prays. This how severe is this statement? So that's the next thing that we have to look at. So a person should not pray. La. The lam here indicates prohibition to the point of haram. That's what's being discussed here, and that's why it's important. Except by his permission. And there's two types of permissions in this situation. So tawqil al-khas, i.e. a specific permission that's given by the imam. He sees someone or a scholar that is visiting or a qari, and he says, I would like you to pray. That's a specific permission. And then tawqil al-am is a general permission. An imam advises, if I'm ever late, then do this in this situation, and appoint a person who's out of the group there to come forward. Or if there's a reason, if there's a well-known reason that the imam's ill, there's been a traffic accident and there's a traffic, and the group decide actually he's not going to get here, etc., etc. So these are the situations where permission can be given. What happens if the masjid rushed, the jama'ah rushed, they started the prayer without seeking permission. The imam comes and he joins in with the jama'ah, which is fine. According to a small number of scholars, the prayer itself is now invalid. Why? Because at the beginning we mentioned la salah. It negates the prayer. We've covered this many times, and although it's haram act, it does not negate the validity of the act itself. So it was an impermissible act, they sinned, they made a mistake, however the prayer is still valid. But it's a serious issue, of course. The next section, going back to the text, is sunnah, the one who prays the prayer, then the iqamah is given for the congregation. It is a sunnah for him to repeat it, other than for the Maghrib prayer. What are we talking about? You prayed Dhuhr at home. You attend the masjid, they're establishing the Dhuhr prayer now. This is saying it is a sunnah for you to repeat it with the jama'ah. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ said in a solid hadith, observe prayer at its prescribed time. And if you can say your prayer along with them, do so. And do not say, I have observed prayer and so I shall not pray. We have many examples of this. We've covered this hadith many times. But this hadith of where two men came in and at Fajr time, and they stood while the Fajr prayer was completed, and the Prophet ﷺ turned around and asked them, what prevented you from both praying with us? They said, we already prayed at our homes. The Prophet ﷺ said, do not do so. If any of you prays in his house and finds that the Imam has not prayed, and he should pray along with him, and that will be a supererogatory prayer for him. So it's a nafil prayer. So we establish a principle here. Repeating an obligatory prayer, is always counted as a nafil prayer. So we have another scenario where one has prayed the obligatory prayer, Dhuhr. He attends a masjid and they're praying jama'ah. So they have prayed 2 rak'ah. When the Imam gives salam, what do? Because it's your nafil prayer now. You've completed your obligatory prayer. So can you just pray 2 nafil prayer? The scholars differ on this. Shaykh Uthaymeen says if he gives the salam with the Imam, he's prayed 2 units and it's nafil, which, you know, could be valid. But if he completes it, it's better. He should complete it. He should complete the 4. Because of the general statement of the Prophet ﷺ, pray whatever you are able to pray and complete whatever you have missed. So general principle, you should complete the prayer. What about a 3 rak'ah situation? Why are we talking about 3 rak'ah? What's the problem? 2, 3, you know, what's the difference? The difference is that we don't want to end on an odd. So it's better for him to get up and add another one. We don't like 3 rak'ah situations except for where it's prescribed. And this leads us on to actually the next point. What if you are prayed Maghrib, you come to the masjid, they're now praying Maghrib, and you pray Maghrib with them. Maghrib is considered the witr of the day. Obviously, the witr prayer after Isha, that's the witr of the night time. This is considered the witr of the day. And the scholars who support this opinion say that 2 witr in a day, 2 Maghribs in a day, no, can't have that. You should only have 1 witr of the day, that's your Maghrib prayer. So actually, if you join the Jama'ah in praying Maghrib, actually you can avoid it because they're making an exception, the Hanbalis here. Or if you do, you add a rak'ah to make it 4. However, Shaykh Uthaymeen says, wait a second, this reasoning doesn't add up. The analogy doesn't make sense. The Prophet ﷺ, when he asked those 2 people who came to pray who came at Fajr time and didn't join in, he said he didn't make an exception for Maghrib, as I mentioned at the bottom of this slide. So yes, Maghrib, we're going to make an exception here. We're going to go against the notes, and actually it's not an exception. Maghrib should also be prayed. And we mentioned whether to add 1 on. There's an opinion that you make it even and pray as a 4 rak'ah, but the class position is actually no, you just keep it odd. You started with the Imam, you finish with the Imam, and that's the class position. Now the last part on this slide is, what if you prayed Jama'ah in 1 masjid and then attended a 2nd masjid which is doing the Jama'ah for the same prayer? This isn't great, because now that's a conundrum, because you're praying 2 congregational prayers. Your obligation, your fard al-ain, was to pray 1 congregational prayer, and you shouldn't repeat unless there's a reason or an exception. There is an exception actually in the Sunnah. So Mu'adh, may Allah be pleased with him, the Prophet ﷺ, he used to pray with the Prophet ﷺ and then go out far to his people and establish Isha in this scenario, and he would lead them. So he'd be leading, and it was a nafil prayer for him, where it'd be the obligatory prayer for the people following. So there are those kind of exceptions, so it can happen. Shaykh Uthaymeen mentions that, listen, by not joining in and just standing there, you're like those blokes who were there, or those companions who were there for Fajr prayer. The optics don't look good. So it's all about showing a united front, having that unity. That's what the congregational's prayer. It never looks good, people standing and watching people praying. And Shaykh Uthaymeen gives an example of Uthman radiallahu anhu, when he made a big call, where he increased in the units of prayer at Arafah. As we know, in Arafah during the Hajj season, Dhuhr and Asr are combined 2 and 2. Uthman, may Allah be pleased with him, was the first in the Ummah to increase in the action of the Prophet ﷺ. He prayed Dhuhr and Asr and made it 4 and 4. Many of the companions were unhappy by this. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he said, "Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un." You know, it was clearly a mistake. Uthman made an ijtihad on this position. However, the companions followed him in this, showing this unity. And the emphasis on this unity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says many times in the Quran, this community of yours is one, and I am your Lord, be mindful of me. Again, uphold the faith and do not divide into factions within it. And further, as for those who have divided their religion and broken up into factions, have nothing to do with them, specifically towards the Prophet ﷺ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is warning the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims about associating with those people who differ or are disunited in their deen and divide into sects. So again, showing that we should participate in the congregational prayer even if we've already prayed. The next part, it is not disliked to repeat a congregational prayer. This wording in this order causes confusion, especially for me. So we're going to go through this. If the Imam leads a Jama'ah in a mosque, in a masjid, and another group comes that are late, it is disliked for this Jama'ah to be prayed again? Is this what we're intending? Is this what we're talking about? The author says no. He's saying it's not disliked for a secondary group to come in and just pray a second Jama'ah. So what we're saying here, the principle is to negate something which is makruh would normally mean that the issue is something which is allowed to do. So what this is actually saying is that it is allowed to repeat the congregational prayer for those people who come into the masjid, for example, late. So this is Shaykh Uthaymeen explains this further by saying this is what Imam al-Hajjawi intended. He's saying it's allowed, rather actually further than that, it's recommended. And actually if we break it down, it goes back to the original principle. If it's not makruh, then it's allowed. It goes back to the original principle. What's the original principle? Congregational prayer is obligatory. So we have a number of opinions that come from this. The first opinion is, there are three different scenarios that we're going to go through. The first one is you have a congregational prayer that is established in a masjid. And they have not one, they have two, three established organized prayers. That's one. Number two is you have only one established prayer, but then some people come in late and they establish another congregational prayer. So unorganized. Number three is that this is a type of masjid where there's so much traffic inflow, and it's a type of masjid where many unorganized congregational prayers happen and there's not one organized congregational prayer as such. So we discussed this in class. That first scenario is just not happening. We talked about the integrity of the Imam. How can you have multiple Jama'ah? That's undermining the one Jama'ah that should happen. All the others are undermining that first Jama'ah. So actually Sheikh says it's makruh, it's actually a bid'ah. Jummah being the exception because of the numbers, lack of, and there's a precedent for this. The second scenario is when the Imam has finished an unorganized situation happens where latecomers organize a congregational prayer. And we said this is the class position, this is the correct position, and we're happy for this to happen. We have the hadith of Ubay ibn Ka'b where the Prophet ﷺ said, a man's prayer said along with another is purer than his prayer alone, and his prayer with two men is purer than his prayer with one. But if there are more, it's more pleasing to Allah. So clear text saying if a group of people are coming and they're about to pray, it's better for them to pray together. The second evidence is another clear text where the Prophet ﷺ, after praying, a man turned up to pray, and the Prophet ﷺ asked his companions, is there any man who may do a good with this man and pray along with him? One of the companions stood up and prayed with him, and this was a repeating of the congregational prayer under the supervision of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ is calling it sadaqah. Amazing. However, we do have opinions that go against this, despite the clear text that we mentioned. Jabir ibn Abdullah radiallahu anhu opinion was that you do not pray the congregational prayer a second time. This was a position of a number of the Tabi'in and Salaf. The Hanafis, they have two narrations where they consider it makruh, tahrimi, seriously disliked, and another saying actually if you do it in private or in the corner then it's alright. Imam Malik says it's makruh, even to the extent where it's bid'ah or haram. And we explained in the class that this was a specific issue at the time of Imam Malik, where there were sects and people praying in their own jama'ah, and maybe that's why he took a more extreme opinion. Imam al-Shafi also considered it makruh. So actually the Hanbalis are the exception here really. Yes, just so we know. So as we mentioned, the evidences actually back up the Hanbali and Shaykh Uthaymeen's and the class position. We have to take a bit of a nuanced position, as we mentioned in the class, is that we take into account where we're praying. So if you go to a hardcore Hanafi mosque where establishing a congregational prayer straight after a congregational prayer, the official one has finished, is going to cause a kerfuffle, then maybe you should pray individually. So yes, we take into account where we are. The Hanbalis then carry on to say that other than establishing a congregational prayer is allowed, it's actually recommended, except for the two mosques of Mecca and Medina. So they're saying it's okay to repeat the congregational prayer except in these two places. And the reason for that is to encourage people to attend the major big jama'ah when it happens. Sheikh says actually this reasoning doesn't make sense because either it applies to all the masjid or none of the masajid. And saying so therefore it's not disliked, and the correct position is that it can be repeated in these two masjids. If the prayer is established and there is no other prayer to be offered other than that obligatory prayer. So this is an important part that we've come on to now. If the prayer is established, what does that actually mean? What is the establishment of the prayer? Is it when the Imam says Allahu Akbar, the Takbirat al-Ihram? When the Iqamah has it started? Or when the Iqamah finishes? Or when the congregational stands? When is it established? And this led to a number of difference of opinions between the scholars. And the three major opinions are when you say Allahu Akbar at the beginning of the prayer. The second opinion is at the start of the Iqamah. The third opinion is at the end of the Iqamah. Sheikh says the wisdom behind this really is to stop people praying when the obligatory prayer, congregational prayer, is established. It's not right that someone should be praying a nafil or a sunnah prayer when the obligatory prayer has been established. However, the Hanafis, as we see sometimes in the masajid, are very strict on order. You cannot pray the two fard sunnah afterwards. Ideally, the order of, especially the two sunnah before Fajr, the two fard of Fajr, it's important to try and pray it beforehand. And in their madhab, they see this as really important to do, to the point where you would pray the sunnah even though the obligatory is being established. Sheikh says it's clear that if a person was to start his nafil prayer after the muqim, the person giving the iqamah, had started the iqamah, then he's not going to finish his prayer. Therefore, it's not permissible for a person to start a non-obligatory prayer after the muqim has started the iqamah. The reason for that is Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. This moment, the reason for prohibition has started. You cannot, as the Prophet ﷺ said, there is no prayer. You are being different from the jama'ah. You can't establish a prayer once the jama'ah is started. However, what happens if you've already started the prayer? And this is again caused another a difference of opinion between the scholars. So there's two positions on this. Neither is it allowed to start or continue. So if he's continued, he needs to finish his prayer or exit his prayer. The second position is that it only applies to starting a prayer, rather not for completing it. So Shaykh Uthaymeen says if we follow this through, you could potentially continue the prayer, but you could still end up missing the jama'ah. Well, that's okay. However, the Hanbalis go further and say if one is praying the supererogatory prayer at the time, he should complete it. Unless he fears he will miss the congregation. So they add something on here, in which case he cuts the prayer. So he should be making that prayer light. So he should be saying Subhana Rabbiyal Azim once, Subhana Rabbiyal A'la once, not maybe reciting a surah, just sticking to the Fatiha, etc., etc. So make it light. If you think you are not going to catch the jama'ah, and you jump in to the obligatory prayer so that you make sure that you catch it. What is the definition of catching the prayer? Well, you'll find out next week, because that's the end of the session today from me. Alhamdulillah, I think this is probably the quickest session I've ever done. It's not quite complete because we need to go through the class positions. But if you want to ask any questions, if you add them on now. So this is the text. The text that we've gone through, and I've shown the modified text where we've disagreed with the Hanbali madhab, the by discussing the evidences, Sheikh Uthaymeen's opinions, and then we've come up with the class positions. So I'm going to go through this now, and this is something that I encourage myself and everybody else as a bare minimum. At the end of each session, over the last 10 years, we have these tabulated summaries that are in one document. I would highly recommend memorizing these because it's only one slide, and it gives you the core class positions. Now it's not going to have the nuances of women prayer. It's, we mentioned that. We mentioned all sorts of other things to do with congregational prayer, permission by the imam given, etc., etc. Those little details are in the text. Not everything can fit in here, but these are the core principles that we should try and memorize, which will be helpful in the exam. So, starting with the congregational prayer, it is an individual obligation for men to pray in congregation for the 5 daily prayers, but it is not a condition. So it's obligatory, it's not a condition. If an obligatory prayer is done at home, even if it's in congregation, it will be considered a valid prayer. For women, it is better to pray at home and to establish a jama'ah if they can, without it ever being obligatory upon them. That's a congregational prayer. Looking at the mosque specifically, it is recommended for the border guards to pray individually due to necessity. So this is different to the text. For everyone else, it is better to attend a mosque in the following order. A person should pray in the mosque that would not establish the congregation without him. Then the mosque that has a larger congregation. Then the mosque which is oldest. Establishing the prayer. It is prohibited to lead in a mosque without the permission of the official imam or unless he is excused. Is that right? Unless he is excused. I think it should say unless he has given permission. Oh no, it is right. Yes, unless he is excused. Whoever prays individually and then the obligatory prayer is established, it is sunnah to repeat his prayer. We do not say it is disliked to repeat an unofficial congregational prayer. Little typo there. If the prayer is established, there is no other prayer to be started other than that obligatory prayer. So, that is the end of session 1. Alhamdulillah. And let's see if there's any questions. Just going to go right to the bottom. Hopefully there's no questions because you all agree that this is an amazing session 1. I've explained everything clearly. There are no questions needed. Let's have a look. Okay, Bismillah. What's the right way to end your salah if you fear that you'll miss the congregation? So, as Mesa said, chapter 22, lesson 10, we can look at that. Essentially, we said to make the salah light. So, that's in the scenario where you feel that you can pray the salah in time to catch the congregational prayer. And catching the prayer, we said, there's different versions of this, so I don't want to jump into next week. But essentially, you could simply just give taslim if you fear that you're going to miss the congregational prayer. However, if you have a look at chapter 22, lesson 10, which is actually the next session next week. So maybe I'll let, I don't know who's doing it next week, one of the brothers to answer that. Any other questions? I'll give it a moment or two before we end well before Maghrib. Alhamdulillah, I think the last few years we've actually overrun into Maghrib, and I felt guilty about that. So that's hence the earlier starting time today. If you do see any kind of errors on the slide, it's a bit too late now, but if any kind of major issues, then please let us know and we can change it. Rahan next week, I should remember that because I'm the one who made the timetable. Jazakallah khair, Mesa. So, brothers and sisters, I hope to see some of you in year 12. Inshallah, it's coming up soon. We will announce that. Another 2 sessions to go, and then we have the exam, which we are preparing for you. And with that, I'll finish. Inshallah, I will see you all soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.